Game of Thrones is responsible for so many great episodes of fantasy television, but its most controversial installment has gone down in history for its storytelling choices. It's no secret that Game of Thrones Season 8 divided fans of HBO's hit fantasy series. There were many complaints about the ending, which focused on everything from Bran Stark becoming king to the regression of characters like Daenerys Targaryen and Jaime Lannister. The final outing was a far cry from earlier seasons in terms of reception, especially since many of Game of Thrones' masterpiece episodes came from the first half of the show. But there were still a few impressive additions to the series in its back half, and even Season 8 has highlights amid all the controversy. For example, the most heavily criticized of Game of Thrones features one of its best performances overall. The HBO series cast was able to make the most of the material they were given, and it shows in the final product. The Bells is the most controversial episode of Game of Thrones. It's rivaled by the series finale. Close-up of Maisie Williams as a bloodied Arya Stark in Game of Thrones Season 8, Episode 5. The Bells may not be the lowest-rated episode of Game of Thrones on IMDb, that honor goes to the series finale, The Iron Throne, but it's certainly the one to get the loudest backlash. The penultimate episode of the fantasy series, The Bells, sees Daenerys Targaryen taking King's Landing at long last. And even after she wins the city and watches the Lannister soldiers surrender, Dany burns the place to the ground. It's a harrowing shift for the character, and one many fans are still unhappy about. Of course, Daenerys burning King's Landing isn't the only reason that viewers are critical of The Bells. While Game of Thrones goes all out with its cinematography and acting in this installment, it makes questionable choices throughout. From Varys' obvious and out-of-character scheming to Cersei's underwhelming end, there's much that doesn't hold up upon a re-watch. And in truth, many of these elements weren't praised when the episode aired. Still, Daenerys' rushed and unpopular Mad Queen turn does take the cake when it comes to criticisms of The Bells. Even viewers expecting Daenerys to follow in her father's footsteps wanted a more thoughtful and drawn-out approach to this scene. It's one of Game of Thrones Season 8's biggest mistakes. It makes The Bells its most controversial episode, and people still talk about it. However, this divisive decision in The Bells results in one of the series' best performances. Despite its problems, The Bells features one of the best performances of the series. Emilia Clarke nails Daenerys Targaryen's dark turn. Daenerys Targaryen looking emotional while smoke blows behind her in Game of Thrones. Emilia Clarke feels born to play Daenerys Targaryen, and her acting in The Bells is top-notch, even as her character's arc crumbles. Game of Thrones doesn't spend enough time on the many losses that lead to Daenerys' decision to burn King's Landing. However, the grief and rage associated with these losses can be seen in Clarke's facial expressions as Dany hears the bells of surrender ringing. Whatever your feelings about the outcome of Daenerys' storyline in Game of Thrones Season 8, there's no denying that Clarke masterfully brings her ending to life. Despite having questionable material to work with, the actress delivers a villain turn that's full of emotion. It's hard to watch as Daenerys makes the choice to raise the city, and Clarke is totally believable, even if the rest of the twist isn't. Even without Tyrion prattling on about The Bells for the entirety of the episode, viewers know exactly what's going through Dany's head as she stares down the Red Keep. Her acting before and after Dany's Mad Queen turn is masterful, but those seconds before she and Drogon take flight are easily the most impressive. They almost make The Bells and its controversial story beats worth it. Emilia Clarke deserved an Emmy for selling Daenerys Targaryen's Mad Queen turn. The cast of Game of Thrones should have won more awards. Emilia Clarke is looking angry as Daenerys in Game of Thrones Season 8 Episode 5. Given how great Clarke's acting was during The Bells, I'm disappointed she never won an Emmy for Game of Thrones Season 8. Of course, this was far from the first time the HBO series was snubbed during award season. Peter Dinklage was the only Game of Thrones cast member to take home an acting Emmy for the show, and perplexingly, it was for Season 8, not even his outstanding performances earlier. Clarke certainly delivered Emmy-worthy scenes throughout Game of Thrones' 8 seasons, too, but The Bells was her most impressive work. It takes an impressive amount of skill to bring an iconic character like Daenerys Targaryen to life in the first place. However, it requires even more talent to sell a character moment that doesn't have the right groundwork. Clarke does that in Season 8, doing Dany justice despite the circumstances working against her. This serves to make The Bells somewhat more watchable, as viewers can be invested in the character, if nothing else. It also extends beyond The Bells and into the Iron Throne. While the writers don't give Daenerys much internal conflict over her choices in the prior installment, instead they lean into a more emotionless, merciless shift, Clarke still manages to inject some humanity into Dany's final moments. Game of Thrones Season 8 highlights how great Emilia Clarke was as Daenerys. She was made to play the character. Clarke's ability to capture the nuances of Daenerys' character, even during Game of Thrones' last 2 episodes, proves she was the right person to play the part. I still can't believe another actress almost played Daenerys in Game of Thrones' original pilot episode. It's difficult to envision anyone falling into the role as seamlessly as Clarke. Clarke fully sold the character during her best and worst moments, and it didn't matter if the script wasn't working in her favor. When Game of Thrones writing was at its best, Clarke's performance shone even brighter. That's why moments like Daenerys stepping onto the pyre in Season 1 and freeing the Unsullied in Season 3 land so well, but even when the writing needed more, Clarke elevated Dany's story with her performance. The Bells proves that she was the one who defined Daenerys and made it so easy for viewers to get invested in her journey. I'm not sure that I'll ever fully be on board with Game of Thrones Season 8's direction for her character, but at the very least, it's well acted. And in many ways, I'm more impressed by that than the well-written moments Clarke nailed.